Can we talk about fasting? I know
Sure.
this gets religious for many people, and I don't want to disrespect anyone's fasting religion. I'm just, hopefully we can encourage people to be curious and consider these things. But I'd like to talk a little bit about your perspective on fasting, potential downsides of fasting, and then maybe we can segue into a quick conversation about autophagy, because I think that autophagy gets thrown around so much. And when you and I had conversations offline, and the more I look into this, it's much more complicated than it's made out to be in the general public. When I talk to people about autophagy, they say, oh yeah, it's house cleaning. And everyone knows that it's good when I clean my house, or, like everyone knows that it's good to sweep the floor, right? Yeah. And so when you don't eat, it's like your body is sweeping the floor, right, Georgie? And I think like, no way, it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah. Cancer also sweeps a lot, as some of these studies showed you.
Right, exactly. So let's talk about this and maybe encourage people to be a little curious about what we really fully understand with autophagy. And, and maybe you can speak to the fact, like, do you think that humans need to do a lot of fasting to get optimal autophagy? And is there something, I think there's more to the story.
So the benefits of fasting that I've seen for people actually to benefit from the fasting are people who really had a very high endotoxin response, kind of mimicking what the older studies showed, that most of the benefits to fasting come from the reduction of endotoxin. Unfortunately, not all people can handle fasting very well. I wouldn't put a fragile person who is, let's say, like, the way I define fragile is I would do a blood work analysis and see what the hormone levels are. If your cortisol to DHEA ratio is higher than 0.5, fasting might actually do a lot more damage than good. Because obviously when you're fasting, cortisol is going to rise even further. And whenever cortisol rises, that further suppresses the synthesis of DHEA. And it's the cortisol to DHEA ratio, which just like the muscle mass, which by the way affects the muscle mass because one of them is a catabolic, the other one the anti-catabolic hormone. The cortisol to DHEA ratio is now recognized as the best predictor of both longevity and also morbidity. So if that ratio is over 0.5, in other words, if it starts going in favor of cortisol, you're basically looking at initially cardiovascular disease, obesity, diabetes, neurological disease, and if it goes further higher, eventually you're looking at things like cancer. In fact, a recent study showed that no cancer patient had a cortisol to DHEA ratio that was below, I think, 1.5, so heavily in favor of cortisol. And we're primed to think, and I think especially doctors are primed to think of cortisol as an anti-inflammatory hormone. I know they give it to a lot of people with cancer in the hospital, right? But it looks like the cortisol is contributing a lot to the growth of specific cancer cells, especially the ones that are difficult to treat. Triple negative breast cancer, recent study came out, showed that it may be triple negative, but it's certainly responsive to hormonal therapy. In other words, if you give it an anti-cortisol drug, basically the cancer disappears. And then I think pancreatic cancer is also notorious for expressing a lot of glucocorticoid receptors. So high cortisol can actually drive that. Maybe what ended up doing in Steve Jobs, because he was he's famous for his chronic and prolonged fasts, and both often and very long. And he was also a fruitarian. Scary story. When Ashton Kutcher was doing the biopic for Steve Jobs, he subjected himself to the diet that Steve Jobs did. He ended up in hospital twice with acute pancreatitis, which, as you know, has a very high mortality rate, but also he freaked the doctor out because that's a precursor stage to pancreatic cancer. And Kushner's old doctor said, whatever you're doing, stop doing it now because I don't want you to end up like Steve Jobs. So these chronic elevations of cortisol, which will happen with fasting, are not good for anybody. But a younger, healthier person is probably in a better position to weather them on and basically kind of benefit from the reduction of endotoxin. But if you are older, like especially if you have the sarcopenic obesity, raising cortisol is perhaps the worst thing you can do for such a person. Older people are notorious for basically getting frail very quickly if they skip even one meal. They don't eat very often, but when they need their meal, if you don't give it to them, they basically can very quickly decline. A bit of a, actually very sad story, but remember this woman that was in a vegetative Terry Shivo, I think she was called. She basically fell on the bathtub, hit her head, and was in a coma in a vegetative state for many years. Eventually, the husband wanted her dead. The parents wanted her alive. They fought through the courts, but eventually the court said, I got to let her expire. Well, what do you do with it? You can't euthanize them. It's not legal in the United States. So what do? They just stopped her food, and she was so frail that within 2 days she was gone. So it shows you that depending on the person, fasting it may not produce the benefits that are desired, and many of those benefits you can probably mimic them by taking charcoal. If that's really what fasting does, reduction of the endotoxin and inflammation. Take some charcoal, take some insoluble fiber. In fact, you can buy some insoluble fiber pretty cheaply on the Amazon and eat like a tablespoon a day. That's probably more than enough, and you don't have to torture yourself. Invariably, I've seen that the people who benefit the most from fasting tend to be younger, leaner, and healthier. The people that are, overweight or on the older side, basically over 50, so to speak, they don't handle fasting well. They may lose weight, but they come out of it. In fact, I'm blanking on the name of the study, but a study showed that people over 50 who fasted chronically, after they ended the fast, they were at a much higher risk of getting a potentially lethal infection. Probably due to the cortisol, immunosuppressant, right? So they fasted for a long time, and then they thought they're healthier. Now they're skinnier, but the obesity paradox strikes again. It's apparently for some people it's better to have the extra weight because you're not fasting and you're eating well to support the immune system than to fast, because if your cortisol to DHEA ratio is high enough and you raise it even further, I don't think anything good will come out of that.
Don't you think also that a young person who wants to fast could achieve the same benefits by doing other things that lower LPS or endotoxin, not eating as many resistant starches that they're probably eating?
I will start with that. Yeah. If you get into the point of fasting, it means you've done so many other things wrong that now you're basically getting to like these desperate measures. You have to fast. Okay. I mean, maybe like a couple hour fast, skipping breakfast and lunch and then eating dinner every once in a while. I wouldn't do this every day. Not like the warrior diet where you're supposed to only eat in this very tight schedule, right? In between, midnight and 6 a.m. And then the rest of the day you don't eat. That's basically the Ramadan fast. But these people do it for a month, and they know very well that actually that you shouldn't be doing more than a month. And in fact, they have a special exemption in the religious text saying that if you're a pregnant woman, if you're a small child, or if you're or sick and old person, you should not be doing the fast. Okay, they can whatever the priest is there, they can tell you, I'm ordering you to not do Ramadan fast because it's bad for you. Allah doesn't want you dead. Allah wants you alive and kicking and functional. So even those people that practice the extended religious fast, they're very well aware it does not work for everybody. And if you're one of these people, you get a pass. You don't get to torture yourself.
So benefits of fasting, primarily reduction of endotoxin coming from undigested food in the colon
and serotonin.
Food. Yeah, and you can achieve that, like you said, charcoal, reducing your soluble fiber, reducing your resistant starches, eating more simple carbohydrates, which everyone is afraid of, honey, fruit juice, fruit. Those would probably all achieve the same thing. Now, in terms of the cortisol to DHEA ratio, is that like, would you do, just so people can do that, would you do like a morning fasted cortisol and a morning DHEA at the same time? How would you measure those to make that ratio? I'm thinking about my blood work. Yeah, and the units of those two also. Do they have to be the same?
I think they're the same. I think they are the same. Yeah, at least in the States they're the same. I think they're milligrams or nanograms or milligrams per deciliter, and I think it's the same range for cortisol and DHEA. We are producing similar amounts of cortisol and DHEA. These are the two hormones that basically, once you reach puberty, cortisol and DHEA are produced at a very high amount. And with aging, DHEA declines, but cortisol production does not. So the cortisol to DHEA ratio actually naturally, if you consider aging naturally increases. So another explanation of why we become catabolic with age and we don't basically respond that well to protein. I'm pretty sure the ranges are the same. Some countries measure them in nanomoles per liter. That's also okay. But basically, I can send you a few studies. I think they use the U.S. and the Western Europe metric, which was in the nanograms per deciliter, and they divided cortisol to DHEA, or cortisol to DHEA sulfate is another good measure. Probably better because the DHEA sulfate is more of a longer term indicator of how much DHEA you're producing. And I think that ratio was about the same. Basically, it should not be more than 0.5. The test that we're doing with my group in Bulgaria with the nail and hair shows this very well because it's a long-term measurement. But if you're doing blood tests, I will do maybe like every 2 weeks for maybe like a month or two, and then average the results out and see how they are. Because like you said, if you're fasted, cortisol is going to be higher than optimal, right? Maybe the best thing is to do in the afternoon because that's when you're supposed to be at your healthiest. Cortisol is supposed to be lowest, DHA is supposed to be highest, and if at that point your ratio is not optimal, then you're probably in trouble.
Yeah. So looking at the cortisol to DHEA ratio, as I'm thinking about it now, it might make more sense to do that one as a non-fasted lab.
Yeah.
And when I was back in the States in March this year, I did blood work because I like to do it as often as possible. And I'm always doing fasting blood work. It's just the norm. And I'm thinking, man, I usually eat now first thing when I wake up, and I don't like not eating because I don't feel as good. And it's something we've talked about on previous podcasts. I think that, getting more glycogen back, I want to keep the cortisol down. So I just think, wow, I'm always doing these fasted blood work because I want to get lipids, and that's the standard is fasting lipids. But I think in the future, I might do more blood work non-fasting and just maybe even do lipids non-fasting and understand that the triglycerides will not be fasting, but everything else will look a little differently. Testosterone obviously has this diurnal pattern. It's highest in the morning. People are used to looking at testosterone that's like a 7:30 or an 8 a.m. testosterone. So interesting stuff though, but maybe the cortisol for DHEA ratio, that's an interesting predictor of overall stress. I think more people should do that.
Morbidity and mortality. And for males, a similar test, which male specific, was cortisol to testosterone ratio. It should be less than 10.
Yes.
And several studies show that people with PTSD, specifically males, have a cortisol to testosterone ratio that's 30 or higher. And in fact, some of these people, when they're given testosterone therapy for unrelated reasons, their PTSD resolved. So it shows that the PTSD really is like a chronic stress that cannot be remediated until the endocrine framework is rebalanced back to normal. So some studies are actually now testing DHEA supplementation for PTSD. Unfortunately, in males and less so in females, if you take a very high dose of DHEA, a lot of it will convert to estrogen. Not so much with testosterone, because even though testosterone is a precursor to estrogen, in fact, a direct one, testosterone itself is a moderately strong aromatase inhibitor. So it will kind of inhibit its own conversion to estrogen. You may still raise it, but DHEA is much better in that, and it's not an effect we want. But still, it shows you that the anti-catabolic hormones for males and for females have this plethora of beneficial effects, both metabolically and mentally, and as longevity, as in general frailness, and everything else.
Let's talk about autophagy real quickly. This is an eye-opening one for me. Do you need to fast to get autophagy, Georgi?
I don't think so. And some of the studies that I showed demonstrated that, in fact, sucrose, trehalose, fructose, and I think maltose, several sugars, when they were administered to the animals, the levels of autophagy rose. So it's not something. Yes, sure. When you're basically fasting, the body has to get the calories from somewhere, and what is it going to do? Probably a good adaptive response is to consume the sick cells, right? The ones that are sending signals that are, I don't know, they're hypometabolic or they're about to turn cancerous and whatnot. So I think that's a good effect, but for how long? I don't think any study has looked at basically at what point does fasting induced autophagy become detrimental. All they've seen is that, yes, sure, in the first 6 hours of fasting, the autophagy rates are greatly increased. But what happens afterwards? What happens if you actually fast continuously? I don't know of a study that looked even at the every day for 6 hours continuous fasting effect on autophagy. My guess is that at some point, the body will downregulate that response simply to preserve tissue, right? And keep you alive for longer. So like anything else, I think every intervention that we try to trick the body into or with has a diminishing return on investment. And I think the same is true, with fasting. I know a lot of people who basically like to eat in the morning, have a very, decent breakfast, and they don't really feel hungry until like 5 or 6 in the evening. And then they eat their dinner at around 7, then they go to bed at 9, and they wake up in the morning and they eat another one. So with 2 meals, you can be in a mild caloric deficit without basically lowering your basic basal metabolic rate too much, and you can still get the autophagy and the endotoxin effects of fasting without actually being fasted. These people don't feel hungry, to me, which is an indication that their blood glucose has not declined that much.
And I think people should also remember that if you're sleeping, most people are not eating in the middle of the night. Yeah. So, last night I go to sleep pretty early. Last night I went to sleep at 8:30. I got up around 5 a.m. I had a little bit of goat's milk and honey, maybe an hour before I went to sleep. And then I had some food pretty soon after I woke up. I still had a 10-hour fast, So I think that it's not so much that people think that they're going to get enough autophagy overnight while they're sleeping. They're thinking they need to do like a 16-hour fast every day or a 24-hour fast or only eat once a day to get autophagy. And I think, wait a minute, do we really know how well calibrated these autophagy mechanisms are? As you point out, some of the foods that are nutrients that we're taking in trigger autophagy mechanisms.
Yep.
Glucose, sucrose, this is triggering some cellular house cleaning.
Glycine does it too. Yeah.
So that's actually taking in nutrients, triggering some degree of house cleaning. And then most people are getting an 8-hour fast or a 10-hour fast overnight. How do we know that's not enough time? And then, as you pointed out in our conversations offline before this podcast, there's at least some signal, and we don't really fully have this understood in the literature, that perhaps too much autophagy could lead to negative cardiac remodeling at the level of the heart. It is maybe even like a precancerous type of thing.
Precancer. In fact, I think there are several trials now where they're basically using drugs that block autophagy, and they're hoping to stop the development of some. I think it was mostly of the gastrointestinal tract, which is a very interesting thing. It means that too much autophagy in your gastrointestinal tract is probably not a good thing. I guess the cells there, they need their energy, and if you don't give the energy through the food, then they may end up consuming each other, but then it's not necessarily a good thing. That actually is one of the core features of cancer. A study that I posted on my blog a couple of months ago showed that cancer cells are very good at devouring the mitochondria of healthy cells around them as a source of fuel. That is a type of autophagy. Unfortunately, they're consuming the normal healthy tissue as well. So we don't know enough about the process to be stimulating it beyond the baseline, which is what's happening while we're sleeping, right? And also in between meals. I mean, I know studies have shown that you do trigger autophagy if you basically have at least 3 or 4 hours between meals. So I don't know of a good reason or argument scientific that we should be increasing it beyond that, because we're triggering a lot of catabolic processes that at some point may get out of hand. Cancer is one such thing. It's probably the epitome of the catabolic processes, and autophagy is highly expressed in most types of solid tumors, not so much in the hematological ones, but the solid ones. So until we know more, I would not try to increase autophagy further by fasting. And fasting, by the way, another thing that's known, that in people with established tumors, yes, it does make the tumors more sensitive initially to chemotherapy, but if the fasting continues, eventually the tumors become very, very aggressive, stop responding to chemotherapy, metastasize, and invariably kill the patient. So I think that's one reason why even mainstream oncologists, they will tell you, do not fast, okay? When chemotherapy or radiotherapy or everything, do not fast, eat your things. Steve Jobs was notorious for getting into these big fights with an oncologist who was begging him to eat some protein. The guy would not eat protein. He would only eat fruit. And the oncologist said, look, cancer is already eating you out from the inside. Unless you consume some protein, that process is going to be accelerated that much, more. So eat some protein. Anyways, I can send you the articles in the popular press how Steve Jobs thought he knew better, and the doctors, listen, you may be a genius in IT, but I'm telling you, you're composed of cells. These cells need protein. You don't need protein, then you become the food for the tumor.
Yeah.